Well, welcome. We're in week 4 of the Bible Challenge, the program under which together we'll go through the entire Bible in 1 year. Every week we'll look at a reading from the Old Testament, a psalm, a reading from the New Testament. This week, week 4, we're in Exodus. We started Exodus last week for our Old Testament readings, and we got up through chapter 3 of Exodus last week. This week it's important to pay attention to how the overall trajectory of movement works in Exodus. In chapter 3 last week we got God revealing his name to Moses. One of the reasons why in Hebrew Exodus is called Shemot, which means the names, because we get names for God in Exodus. He reveals to Moses and to the people who he is and what his will for them is. When I talked about a trajectory of movement, we should pay attention to the fact that chapters 1 through most of 15, through 15:21 actually, where are the people? Well, they're basically in Egypt. This is the whole bit about the call of Moses, the Lord hearing the outcry of the people in Egypt as slaves, Hebrew slaves in Egypt, all of the plagues that come upon Egypt, the whole story of the crossing of the Red Sea. At the end of chapter 15, we've completed that crossing, and then into chapter 19, the beginning, the people are in Sinai, or on the way to Sinai, I should say. That's part of the transition in where they're actually moving. And then in chapters 19 through 40, the people are in Sinai. Now we're actually wandering around in the wilderness. What happens here? Well, we start out in chapter 4, and the readings began overall in Exodus with the commissioning of Moses with miraculous powers by the Lord, and his return to Egypt now happens. And we continue through the following elements of the story in Exodus. We have the confrontation with Pharaoh in chapter 5. If you remember the old spiritual Go Down Moses, that's where this comes from. Go down Moses, way down to Egypt land, and tell Pharaoh, let my people go, or words to that effect. Moses' call is confirmed after his initial confrontation with Pharaoh. In the account in chapter 4 of God's commissioning of Moses, we get additional detail that's going to be concluded in chapter 6. And this is probably because of the fact that we're dealing with more than one authorial strand, as we talked about before. We've got the Yahwist and the Elohist involved, Elohist involved here. Different writers at different times saying, what are the details that the people need to hear, and kind of playing off each other. Moses in chapters 7 through 10 that we'll encounter this week again confronts Pharaoh, and we get the 10 plagues of Egypt from chapter 7 through chapter 13. This is when we get plagues of frogs. This is when we get the Nile being turned into blood. This is when we get the Egyptian magicians saying words to the effect, well, hey, we can do that too. This is going to culminate in the Passover, when the firstborn of Egypt will be killed by the angel of death, in effect. And the Hebrews will celebrate the Passover and mark the lintels of their houses so that death will pass over their house. This is the origin of Passover we're going to get here, and we're going to be reminded in every subsequent Passover celebration in Judaism that things are supposed to happen in a hurry because the people are in a hurry at the first Passover. So we get the deliverance from Egypt in chapters 11 and 12, the journey of the escape to the east in chapter 13, which includes the account of the destruction of the Egyptian armies, the crossing of the Red Sea, 13, 14, 15, and how the armies are destroyed. Here's where we start getting the Lord proceeding as a pillar of fire and as a cloud, how the Lord is present, and that's going to be an important theme really throughout the first 5 books of the Bible here. God showing up as a character in a drama. Stories are being told here. One of the people talking in the stories, one of the people acting in the stories, one of the people whom people talk to in the stories is God. He's very present. In the case of the fire and the cloud, he is physically present. Then we get into the wilderness, chapters 16 through 18, and the people are tested. We get the whole account of the bitter water at Marat, which is a play on words in Hebrew that basically is talking about bitter water. We get the quails and the manna. This is going to show up again in chapter 11 of Numbers. And we get a lack of water. The problem and the pattern seems to be that the people sit there and say, hey, why'd you bring us out here? We seem to have had it better in the past in that we had all this good food in Egypt. Now they're forgetting that they cried out to the Lord because they were oppressed. They're forgetting that they were subject to genocide in that Pharaoh was killing their firstborn. Notice the parallelism there, that the Hebrew-born males are killed by Pharaoh, and then in the final plague of Egypt, the firstborn of Egypt are killed. And so the people sit there and bewail in the wilderness and say, why have you brought us out to this place to die? First, we get Moses striking the rock with his staff and water coming forth. And one would think this would be something pretty cool and miraculous, but then we immediately go into another complaint. We don't have anything to eat. Manna from heaven is given. And we get another complaint. What is this manna? We're not familiar with it. Only if we had meat. And then we get quails raining down on the place. And between this account and the account in Numbers, we're going to see how, particularly in Numbers, we're going to see how at some point God seems to be saying to the people, oh, you really want that? Well, let me tell you how it's going to be, so that they get to the point where the quail is almost making them ill. One of the Psalms refers to it stinking in their nostrils. So we see human nature at play here, with the people as a collective character, dealing with God as a character in the drama. Moses kind of standing in there a bit as an intermediary and intercessor. We get a defeat in chapter 17 of the Amalekites. These are people standing in the way. And Moses defeats them using the rod he used to defeat Pharaoh. So there are these miraculous powers being deployed. The Lord fights for Israel when the rod is raised. And just as Jethro had met Moses when Moses escaped from Egypt, now he meets Israel. So we see a lot of strands of story coming together. Jethro, a non-Israelite, recognizes the Lord as the all-powerful God. And the people at this point still seem to question some of that. So we're going to get introduced very early on in the Bible here in Exodus. This idea that's going to become prominent, for example, in Mark's Gospel, that the people who recognize God are outsiders. If we put that in our modern context of the church, we are in grave peril whenever we think that because we're churchgoers, because we're members of a church, that we have some special access to God. We need to remind ourselves that in Mark's Gospel, for example, the only ones who ever recognize who Jesus is are outsiders. Now, God's covenant with Israel, we're going to go this week through chapter 21. The section that starts this week, though, really concludes in chapter 24. And this is where the whole covenant starts coming up. When we get to chapter 20, we're going to get the Ten Commandments. Now, what's different about this from other things in ancient religion? Well, the primary difference is that it's about relationship. God is not some supernatural power that we could just make a mistake and walk into his sacred grove without knowing it was sacred to him and be turned into a snake or something like that, like we find in Greek mythology. God is somebody who relates to the people and tells them how they are to relate to him. he tells them, here are the rules. I'll be your God, you will be my people, and here's how we do it. This is where we get the 10 Commandments, later where we'll get all of the law. So if Genesis started out very much about God and creation, and then shifted gears into God and his people, first in the person of Abraham, then in the patriarchs Isaac and Jacob, Israel, then in the story of Joseph. Now we're continuing that theme. Yes, God remains the God of creation, but God is also the God of relationship. And that's very different from any other ancient model of belief. Very different from the sort of deist model that's popular in our world today that says, well, there's some supernatural power that makes things go, but is he really involved in my life? We're going to see, starting in the Old Testament, yes, he is. And that's going to become personalized very much more in Jesus. Israel encounters the Lord very palpably in Sinai and receives the 10 Commandments. We get all the stories of light, of presence, of thunder. Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments written in stone. And in the 10 Commandments, we get a series of injunctions which relate to proper governance of Israel as God's chosen people. So basically the commandments are saying, here's how you relate to me, and here's how you relate to each other. And if the one's out of balance, the other's going to be out of balance. They have to come together. The way we see at the cross, for example, our relationship with God being mediated as well by our relationship with each other, that horizontal dimension. The code has a strong ethical content to it relating to proper conduct in community. It includes issues of the regulation and protection of property, for example, restitution of wrong. We also get rules here besides the 10 Commandments, and we get issues relating to community ethics, sexual ethics. Here's where we first start getting the so-called Lex Talionis, which basically is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So the first time the law gets revealed, it looks a lot more ancient. It's going to evolve throughout the law of the 5 books of Moses or Torah, and of course it's going to evolve throughout the prophets, and it's going to evolve principally in Jesus Christ. But the first revelation starts looking like ancient law, except that it's not arbitrary. It's just set forth by the Lord in terms of who he is and how his people are to relate to them. So there aren't supposed to be any surprises here, unlike most ancient faith. Now, we're going to continue in that section next week, but this week we get only through chapter 21 in Exodus, and so let's switch gears and look at the Psalms that are going to come up this week. Well, we start out with the second half of Psalm 18, and we go through Psalm 23. Psalm 18, the second half, continues a royal hymn of thanksgiving. In part 1 of the psalm, we're talking about God intervening to save the king from his foes. Part 2, God is now described as equipping the king with strength to triumph over his foes. So, again, first about how an individual might relate to God, and then about how that relationship is translated into power in and for community. Psalm 19, we've got 2 parts. First part basically being a creation hymn, and the second part being a wisdom hymn. The law is described in wisdom terms, and the law is thus described as something that's part of God's creation, how he reveals who he is and what his will for us is. Psalms 20 and 21, more royal psalms basically, a prayer of the people that God grant the king victory in battle, and then a hymn of thanksgiving. 22 now, we switch gears importantly. Psalm 22 is going to be the psalm that we're going to hear on Good Friday. And this is the psalm that in many ways has motifs that will be fulfilled in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So, In Matthew's Gospel, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus' last words on the cross are, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my Lord, or my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the first line of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Then as we read through the psalm, the person who is speaking is talking about being surrounded by enemies. He's talking about having his bones pulled out of joint. He's talking about having his hands pierced. He's talking about being thirsty and being offered vinegar. He's talking about those who surround him casting lots for his clothing, everything that we're going to actually see in the crucifixion. The psalm actually ends on a note of triumph, with the speaker saying he's going to proclaim God's greatness in the great congregation. So there are two possible ways we can look at Psalm 22. One way is to sit there and say, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me, on the cross in Mark and Matthew. One way to look at that is to say, well, he's starting to say Psalm 22 because of what's going on. And he just dies before he gets to the end with a note of triumph. And so we should just view this as a note of triumph, but it gets cut short by circumstance. That is one view. It's a minority view. It's a view that I don't personally subscribe to because it says, well, stuff just happens and God's not in control, even when he's revealing his glory on the cross. The majority view in the history of the church has always been that Jesus calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because there is no human experience that he does not assume in order that he might not redeem it. This is St. Anselm's argument. That which is not assumed is not redeemed. So, what is assumed with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? What's assumed is things like abandonment and real human despair. Even though we know God is in charge, even though we have faith, we do experience human despair. We do see written on a wall at Auschwitz, for example, the line from the Psalm, I think it's 44, I'd have to go back and look it up, which says, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. Why have you forgotten us? Jesus, in saying, my God, why have you forsaken me, is assuming that depth of human despair in order that he might lift it up and redeem it in his resurrection as an offering to God in the crucifixion. And then we get where? To Psalm 23. Probably the best known psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. This is a psalm that is used in funerals a lot. It's a psalm that is used in hospice situations when somebody's dying or in a hospital situation. My own experience has been that if you're going to use Psalm 23 at a deathbed, and usually if the family wants a psalm, that's going to be the one. You'd better use the King James translation. That's the one they want. That's the one they know. If you pull out any other translation, they'll get a little upset. But what's interesting about Psalm 23 is also another parallel we're going to run into in the Gospels. It's most clear in Mark's Gospel in chapter 6. It also happens in the other Gospels, but it's when Jesus has gone off into the wilderness to get away from people, and they chase after him. And Jesus looks upon them. Now, the word that Mark uses to describe the wilderness is a Greek word, eremon. And eremon in Greek we can translate as wilderness, but the sense is more desolate place or desert. And it says that Jesus looks on the crowd and has compassion for them because they are like sheep without a shepherd. And then he has them lie down on the grass. Excuse me? Grass? Green grass? We're in the desert. Where'd the green grass come from? Hint. Now he's looking at them as a shepherd having them sit down on the green grass, and now we get the miracle of the feeding with the loaves and the fishes. So he's setting a rich table in front of them. In other words, what's going on in that whole feeding of the 5,000 is Psalm 23 being enacted and personified by Jesus. The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord shows up as the shepherd. The Lord gives me a rich feast before me. The Lord shows up and does that. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Again, it's about relationship. One other thing about Psalm 23, if you want to do one of these sort of history religions approach and say where stuff comes from, is that when it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. The word in Hebrew for evil, the phonetic root, is Ra, the name of the Egyptian god, the chief Egyptian god. So kind of, collective memory of people who have been slaves in Egypt and who have been subject to genocide in Egypt are saying, though I walk through the valley of the death, I won't fear Ra, because the Lord is with me, the powerful God is with me, and nobody else can mess with me if God is on my side. So Psalm 23 has a lot of language and themes that both look backwards and forwards, and we're going to see Psalm 23 enacted in a couple places when we get to the Gospels. The Gospel this week, we're in chapters 19 through 24 in Matthew, and so we're including Jesus exercising authority in teaching and inviting the people to become his disciples. Notable teachings are given on divorce. Parables are frequent. Jesus emphasizes the cost of discipleship. He says, unless you can say goodbye to father and mother and home and goods, you can't really follow me. Now, is he telling us all to divorce our families? Obviously not. But if we keep things in perspective that God comes first and all others come second, even somebody as dear to us as a spouse or a family member, are secondary to our relationship with God, then we start seeing that balance between the vertical and the horizontal coming together. And once we realize that, our relationship at the horizontal, our relationship with the spouse, with the family member, is actually strengthened because it includes God more. Jesus is not telling us to just, beat our breasts and bewail ourselves. But he's saying there is a cost of discipleship. That when he says, follow me, he's calling us to the cross. And when he says, take up your cross, he's talking about something we do voluntarily. In other words, it's not a burden. Elsewhere he says, all ye that are heavy laden, come to me and I will refresh you. He's saying, I'll lift the burden from you. When he's saying, take up your cross, that's something we do voluntarily. It could be something like, I could have a lot more toys if I didn't engage in stewardship and give some of my money to the church. I could do a lot of things if I didn't set aside time for worship. I could do a lot of things if I didn't care about other people and help them in any way. That is something that is done by the act of will. It is voluntary. That's what taking up the cross looks like. When Jesus speaks with authority also, the people are kind of surprised by this because they say, what is this? A new teaching, one with authority, not as one of the scribes. What they're talking about here is, speaking about divorce, for example, Jesus doesn't sit there like a lawyer and quote authorities and say, well, according to Rabbi Hillel, this, or according to Rabbi Gamaliel, this. He says, you have heard or you have read X, Y, Z, but I say. In other words, he just says, I'm telling you what it is. This is something that people haven't experienced before in rabbinic teaching. So he's enacting who he is, that he's in charge. In chapter 20, he predicts his own passion. And how do the disciples react? Well, they're basically continuing to look for personal gain. Like, who's going to get to sit at your right hand and who's going to get to sit at your left hand? Jesus enters into Jerusalem. and disputes over his authority continue and get sharpened with the temple authorities. And then the narrative shifts from teaching and disputes to a series of woes and a teaching about the end of the age. Chapter 23 really marks the beginning of the shift, concluding with a lament over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that stones the prophets. We need to keep that in mind when Jesus tells us when we follow him, we'll receive a prophet's reward. Again, he's reminding us that there is sacrifice involved in being his disciple. Now, in chapter 19, verses 16 through 30, Matthew tells the same story found in Mark 10, Luke 18, and Mark and Luke has Jesus say that only God is good. Matthew renders this as one there is who is good. Matthew 19:17. We can compare that as well with the opening verses in John's Gospel, where it says in the beginning was the Word. It would be interesting to know what Jesus' tone of voice is here in talking to the young man who wants to know what he's supposed to do. And he says, good teacher. And Jesus says, why do you call me good? There's only one who is good. So the tone of voice here might be Jesus saying something to the effect, is this young man recognizing who I am? Or is he just thinking theoretically? And this might be why he gives the young man a rather strong instruction about selling all he has, and the man going away sorrowing. Jesus is not necessarily giving us a blanket rule for all of us that we're supposed to impoverish ourselves. He's looking at the young man and saying, you, singular, lack one thing. If you would be perfect. In other words, the stuff that's getting between who you're called to be and who you are might be literally this stuff. And so that tone of voice might be interesting if we could hear Jesus speak. Why do you call me good? What's going on here? Jesus might be testing the young man here. When we get to the famous story of paying taxes to Caesar in chapter 22, Pharisees seek to trap Jesus. They give him a denarius, Roman daily wage coin, and they say, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? They want to be able to bring charges against him, say, violating Roman law. And Jesus famously says, whose likeness and inscription is this? And render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. And everybody's dumbfounded at this wonderful wisdom, but we should remember one thing about the coin itself. Each emperor had new coins minted, and the coin shown to Jesus would probably have been one that read on it, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, great high priest. In other words, Jesus is making more of a point here about idolatry than about taxes. He's reading what's written on the coin and saying, divine, excuse me. Now, this isn't just about taxes. We get the great commandment given in chapter 22, that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind, all our strength, etc., and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Reminding ourselves that when Jesus summarizes the law this way, he's quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, and from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. So we need to go back and look at Deuteronomy 6 and look at Leviticus 18 and say, what else is going on there? And when we do that, that's going to make us uncomfortable. Because if we exclude everything else in those chapters because they make us uncomfortable, those parts, then what do we do with Jesus quoting from those and saying, this is important? Finally, we get Jesus mentioning the desolating sacrilege when we're supposed to flee to the hills in chapter 24 here. This may be an allusion to the first book of the Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 54, and chapter 6, 7. The term desolating sacrilege actually comes from the 9th, 11th, and 12th chapters of Daniel. And this is referring to the time when the Seleucid rulers of the Near Mideast, these are Greek sort of petty monarchs that are heirs to Alexander the Great's empire. When Alexander the Great dies in Afghanistan in 323 BC, his generals form their own kingdoms. We get one in Palestine. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he got really tired of the way the Jews did things, so he tried to make things change by first sacrificing a pig on the altar in the temple, the desolating sacrilege. This is when warfare breaks out. His next move was to import foreigners and have them settle in the area and try to dilute how Judaism worked. These people eventually became the Samaritans, and this is why in the famous parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel, we see that the Jews and the Samaritans don't get along. They're considered those, nasty foreigners. We're also going to see Jesus encounter the Samaritan woman at the well in John's Gospel, chapter 4. Some of that comes in here. When Jesus is talking about the desolating sacrilege, in Matthew's Gospel, which is probably written in the mid-80s, this is written at a time when the temple has already been destroyed. The temple has been destroyed by the Roman army in the year 70. So Matthew, recording what Jesus said before that, is putting his readers in mind that now things have changed. Matthew's also writing about the same time that since the temple has been destroyed, the Pharisees have gotten together, formed their own council. It becomes known as the Council of Jamnia, modern Haifa, year 85. And all along, the Christians have usually been members of synagogues called the Way or the Nazarenes or continuation goes here. So quoting about the desolating sacrilege in the context of the temple already being destroyed and in the context of people being kicked out of the synagogues may be an allusion to the fact that times are changing around Matthew as he's writing. That's as far as we're going to get this week. Next week we will conclude Matthew's Gospel. We'll get all the way to the penultimate chapter of Exodus. We'll continue plowing through the Psalms, and we'll start in Mark's Gospel. But that's it for week 4.